Greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I'm your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and I am Executive Director and founder of the Center for Black Literature at Medgar Evers College, Director of the National Black Writers Conference, and a Professor of English. This radio broadcast and viewing is paid for by Medgar Evers College. And so I am pleased today to have with me on Writers on Writing the Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce. Welcome, Dr. Pierce.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm very, very excited about your book. I just want to share with our listening audience some information about you because you are truly a phenomenal woman. I'm just so impressed. So the Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce is professor and dean of the Howard University School of Divinity in Washington, D.C. She is the first woman to be appointed as dean in the Divinity School's 150-year history. She also served as the founding director for the Center for African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And previously, she has served as the founding director of the Center for Black Church Studies and associate professor of religion and literature at Princeton Theological Seminary. So her specialties include African American religious history, Womanist Theology, African American literature, and race and religion. A widely published author, her work focuses on the historical and contemporary significance of the African American religious tradition. And in addition to her teaching and academic scholarship, Dr. Pierce is a dedicated mentor, community activist, board member of a foster care agency, and cable news commentator. This will be very comfortable for you. She believes that teaching and scholarship are meaningful only if they enhance people's lives. Thus, she works tirelessly to bridge the gaps between pulpit, pew, and the academy. Very, very exciting. You are embodying all the principles of what we should be doing as teachers, as activists, and using what we have gained over the years to make every moment teachable. And of course, activism is necessary. And this is really the embodiment of your book. Your book, In My Mother's House, Black Women Faith and the Stories We Inherit, just really, really touched me. It brought back many memories of my mother, you know, of the conflicts around the church, you know, of the wisdom and of all of those other women who've touched my life in many ways. So I really, really thank you for sharing with us your story, which relates to so many people.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I just like to begin, we're going to get you talking with the first page in your book. There is a name. In my grandmother's house, the religion was real and tangible. In my grandmother's house, Jesus was a Black man. Despite the habits of others of their generation, born right after the Great Depression, my grandparents never displayed a picture of white Jesus. Now that is phenomenal, particularly in the age in which you grew up.
Yes.
And so I'd like to begin by having you reflect and share what that meant for you and how that has been significant for you in your life, your scholarship, your work.
Thank you. That's a great way to begin. It's an honor to be with you here and to say hello to all of my folks in New York, and it's just a joy. So by training, I'm a womanist theologian, which is someone whose academic specialty in theology centers on Black women's experiences. And so womanist theology, as you know, of course, grows out of the fact that the theologians in the 1960s, the Black theologians in the 1960s and 70s were writing primarily about Black men. The feminist theologians in the 1960s and 70s were writing primarily about white women. So womanist theology is born as women were being formally trained in the academy to do theological work. So I started my reflection in the book about the fact that my grandparents were absolutely adamant about giving me images of the divine that looked like me. I didn't appreciate that as a child. I simply, was a little girl growing up in an all-Black neighborhood in Brooklyn, going to all-Black schools. And so, no big deal as far as I was concerned. But when I look back on it, I really think about the ways in which they had to fight dominant messaging, dominant propaganda, right? Dominant, ideologies about who Jesus is or what the divine or the sacred is. And so they wanted me to know that this little brown girl growing up in Brooklyn, New York, was made in the Imago Dei, the image and likeness of God. And so in our house, there was a picture of brown Jesus or Black Jesus and had locks or brown skin and a large nose. And so I looked at that picture every single day of my life. And I talk about how even now, when I see the young brothers here on the campus of Howard University, or I'm on the Metro, or the Black men in my life, I see the image of Jesus. And what an amazing gift it is to give a brown child in a world that is hostile, right, to Blackness, the gift that one is made in the image of God.
That is amazing. What was it in your parents' life or your grandparents, that really gave them that impetus to celebrate the Black men, the Black presence in the Bible? Because that certainly was not, as you indicate, that was not what we were being taught.
No, we're still trying to come to terms with it.
Yeah.
Right? So we are still working on the kind of scholarship and the theology that affirms people of African descent in this particular culture. I wonder, I don't have an exact answer, but I wonder if for my grandparents, like so many others who had to leave the South, the rural South, and they were migrants at the end of the Second World War and came from North Carolina and Georgia to places like New York and Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., that they were fleeing such hostile, racialized circumstances, from lynching to Jim and Jane Crow to segregation. And so perhaps in that reality, they wanted to create a space that was safe for their children and their grandchildren. So it's something that I actually see when I look at, say, the Shrine of the Black Madonna and other places, largely in these cities, in New York and Chicago and even in LA, where pockets of Black Southerners ended up and really, I think, tried to pull out aspects of their faith that were life-affirming in a world that was so hostile to who they were.
Because coming to the North, as you said, that was a traumatic experience for many. So how do you bring that culture, that awareness, how do you bring that into your home as a migrant? Yes. You talk a lot about the prayer warrior. And can you share with us what you meant? What is the relevance of being a prayer warrior in your life? What has it been in your life? If you can give us specific examples, and as a womanist, a Black womanist.
So I grew up raised by my grandparents, but I really always thought about women as very powerful spiritual workers. So aside from the role of the pastor, who was a man in the tradition in which I was raised, really all of the spiritual work was being done by women. And so these prayer warriors were largely women, church mothers, as we would call them, who would tarry and fast and pray. And when I say tarry, we would enter that storefront church in Brooklyn at, 8, 9 o'clock and would literally stay overnight and pray and fast. I was a child, they let me sleep, but they stayed up and they prayed. So this idea of the prayer warrior is literally someone who goes into battle, right? So metaphysical battle, sometimes even spiritual battle, but some kind of battle armed and equipped with prayer, really as their weapon. For me, it's thinking about how defenseless in some ways Black women were then and still are, so that this kind of metaphor of battle, this kind of metaphor of warrior was, I do have some defensive weapons. I do have a way to deal with like the world that is raging around me. And so these church mothers and these prayer warriors really sought, especially like I said, growing up in these urban environments, to create a hedge of protection around the young people in their church and in their community. And so just this image for me of growing up in a church setting where you would pray and tarry all night long. The sun would rise before you would actually, that kind of faith and dedication and devotion for me is really powerful in my own childhood, but also as I think as a womanist theologian, the ways in which Black women have entered in and accessed spiritual power, even if they are not necessarily the leadership, right? They might not be the person in charge. They might not be the person whose name is on the marquee, but they have spiritual power in a wide variety of settings.
And in this time, you know, with the COVID epidemic, the racial epidemic, you know, the economic, with what we're going through, that is so important now. And I think what your book reminds us is not to forget that.
Yes.
The power of prayer. Yeah. One of the things, you are a religious scholar, but you also are very much into literature. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that the epigraphs in your book alternate between those in the Bible and literary writers.
Yes.
And so Zora Neale Hurston obviously is a favorite of yours. You have a quote, "The work of her hands." I want you to talk about the work of her hands, but I just want to read the epigraph that you used from Moses, Man of the Mountain by Zora Neale Hurston. "Now you all prop me up on every leaning side. Don't let my hands fall. We're holding up the world with these hands."
Yeah, thank you. I love that. I love Hurston. I have a PhD in religion and literature. And so my work has always been at the intersection. Very, very grateful that as an undergraduate had an opportunity to be trained and to take a class with the late Toni Morrison. So Zora Neale Hurston is just a joy. So the work of her hands, one of the things that I was thinking about was the generation of women like my grandmother did not have some of the opportunities and access to the creativity that was, I know, embodied in them, right? And so I think about my grandmother as an artist and what she did with her hands. And small things from braiding my hair, right? So the image of that loving grandmother who has the granddaughter, you know, sitting on the floor and she's braiding her hair, or the creating a feast. It would always surprise me as a child. I would look in the refrigerator and I would be like, there's no food in here. She would go in the refrigerator and, you know, an hour later there was a feast. And so are we thinking about the ways in which Black women are artists, right? That they're using the work of their hands in ways that we don't typically consider to be art, to be culture, but that's where they have found a place for expression, whether that's quilting, right? Or cooking or doing hair. And so I was very fortunate growing up to have lots of opportunities to go to school, to go to college and graduate school and to explore these things, and then discover unfortunately, I have very little artistic talent, but I grew up with these church mothers and grandmothers who never had that opportunity. And so their art came out in such physical ways, their caretaking of the community, the love that they poured into the food, the cookies that they baked, or the pound cakes or the sweet potato pies. And so that we really think about the ways in which Black women have embodied an artistic impulse, even if it hasn't shown up in ways that we traditionally understand the artistic impulse.
That's a very, very important concept, because we're not very often aware of the creativity and we don't celebrate that creativity.
Absolutely.
And you also talk about expanded notions of family, that we have to think about family in different ways. And of course, this touched you personally. And I think, like, particularly in this time when we have so many people who feel marginalized and alienated, either because of this pandemic or because of racism or because they're marginalized in their academic communities. There's so many ways that people have been silenced and feel invisible.
Yes.
But you talk about how we can find family in different ways and how we need to redefine what is meant by family. Can you reflect on that?
Yeah, so I talk about what for me is a very critical biblical passage for those who are familiar with it, where Jesus is on the cross. And so he calls his favorite disciple and he calls his mother, and he basically says to the two of them, take care of each other. Right. And so I reflect on that because for me, family is not about blood, but it is about the desired relationships between individuals. So when you grow up in a tradition in which there is a mother's board, right, that is an official ecclesial tradition. So you have these women called mothers. Obviously, they're not biologically your mother. Some of them were not even biologically mothers at all to any children, but functioned as this generational griot in a certain kind of sense, right? And so we established families, particularly for African Americans. Our history is fraught with the fracturing, the deliberate fracturing of our family. And so the ways in which we have able to be made whole is to create these families, these kinship networks. It is the aunties and the cousins and the other mothers and the grandmamas and the godmothers and the all different ways that we have to describe it. Not necessarily flesh and blood, but still kinship. And I love Zora Neale Hurston when I think about that as well. She talks about in one of her novels, these two women who are best friends, right? That they have their tongues in each other's mouths, which is like they're one person, they're one and the same, they're on the same, wavelength, and one talks and the other answers. And that's what kinship is. And so we have to really, I think, both edify and celebrate that we've been able to create kinship in a space that has deliberately tried to fracture our families.
Right. And how do we do that, again, going back to what we're going through now? How do we get people to think about that in ways that will really help them to overcome, to not feel so alienated? Because we can talk about it theoretically about what we should be doing, but how do we enact that in our lives?
It's such this historical moment. We don't have anything to compare it to. But here in Washington, D.C., and I imagine the case was in New York City as well, many houses of worship closed. They actually closed their doors and went online, although, of course, some have since reopened. And one of the things that I remember that was so clear to me, it was, how are we going to get our elders access to this worship experience if many of them are technologically challenged, right? Don't have iPads or don't know how to use them or don't use smartphones or what have you. And part of that was who are your elders? If your elders are only the people to whom you're related by flesh and blood, many of us would feel very alone in this world. But if in fact we have a notion of the things that I do for these folks because they belong to me, right? So these are our elders, not my elders. These are also our children and not just a particular person's children. So I wonder if part of the answer is our stripping away of kind of proprietary notions of family to suggest that every time I help an elder, it matters whether that elder is mine. Every time that I am affirming to a child, mentoring a child, it doesn't matter what my biological position is. So I'm just grateful for the women in my church growing up who raised me. It was clear that they understood themselves as being part of my village and being deliberate about raising me, whether I liked it or not, but they surely did.
I like the concept of they are your children too. In the book that I haven't written yet, that is the chapter that I have as someone who's been in the educational system for decades. And I believe that if we really truly thought about the young people we're teaching as if they were actually our children, we would change the dynamics that go on in the classroom. We would change what happened because we would take that responsibility. So,
Yes.
I mean, now part of what we do as educators and as caretakers is again to try and reinforce that. You know, I think that's part of what's been missing, and that's why we need people like you, you know, in our classrooms. That's why our young people need role models.
Absolutely.
They need people who are very, very clear about who they are and who will embrace them
Yes.
and all of their flaws and their strengths and teach them.
Yes.
So I'm going to go back to this whole notion of silencing and invisibility, because you also quote Audre Lorde, who you obviously also were impressed with. Audre Lorde, Black feminist writer, said, "My silence is," she reminds us that our silence will not protect us. She said, "I was going to die sooner or later, whether I had ever spoken myself. My silences had not protected me. Your silences will not protect you. What are the words you do not have yet? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you will sicken and die of them, still in silence?" I think that is so powerful.
So powerful. Absolutely powerful. With Lorde, you know, I was thinking really primarily about my experience in higher education as a faculty member and a professor for my entire career. And I was thinking about all of the times in which I swallowed my words, in which I was silenced. There's a difference between choosing to be silent. Sometimes I choose not to speak. That is a choice on my part. But I can recall far too many occasions, unfortunately, where I felt silenced. And Audre Lorde reminds us that no matter what you do, they're going to think about you, whatever they think about you. I was being silenced because I didn't want to, I thought, play into the angry Black woman stereotype. So something would happen and I would react, and then they would say, "Oh, she's angry." I actually wasn't angry at all. Sometimes joyful, sometimes passionate, but these certain kinds of stereotypes, they actually silence us. And so I was going to be just the nice, happy Black woman. And I realized it was stifling my voice. It was keeping me from speaking truth to power. And so Lorde says, they're going to do what they're going to do. They're going to think what they're going to think, but you're choking on your words in the meanwhile because you are silencing yourself when you know you ought to speak. Such a powerful reminder. There are times, though, that you are silent out of choice. You are silent because you need the atmosphere to just sit. And sometimes it is heavy, and you just need that to sit in that silence as well. Sometimes the best way we can support the people we love is to just sit quietly with them. But we really need to be clear that when we are being silenced, we're going to usually end up choking on those words. And so we have to have the courage to speak, as she would say, even when our voice shakes.
And you translate that into your experiences. Powerful metaphor for the name of this chapter, Valley in the Shadow of Whiteness. Yeah, which reflects on your experiences, you know, as an educator. So one of the things that you know, we've been talking about people who've influenced you. You've been influenced by theologians, by scholars, by literary people. Who are the people that you're reading? Who are the writers, other than what we've talked about, who've influenced you as a scholar and writer?
So my favorite writer is James Baldwin. I love him. I teach his work. I come back to James Baldwin again and again. I read James Baldwin, and I'm being deliberate with my use of language, like scripture, which is to say that the best of writers you return to time and time again at different places in your own life, right? So the Baldwin I read when I was in college is not the Baldwin that I'm reading now, right? His text hasn't changed, but I've changed. And so that is just a person I return to time and time again. So what I'm also reading quite a bit now is poetry. I love poetry. I'm not a poet. I have deep respect for poets, but I'm finding right now that within African-American poetry in particular, a renaissance, a way to use the spare kind of language to really talk about all of these huge social problems, right? So environmental racism here, police brutality, and you name it, health disparities, literally right now. And the problems are so big and so discrete, but Black poetry kind of gets to the essence of it. So I'm reading quite a bit of poetry. And then like most of my time is, spent running this school and, kind of being a dean. But I look forward to getting back to my habits of reading just for pleasure, because it's definitely been a long time since I've been able to read for pleasure.
Right. And so, as you segue into my next question, because you are a dean, very heavy administrative responsibility, you're still writing, you're a reverend. How do you balance your life, and what messages would you have for people who are dealing with these multiple roles, and mother,
Yeah.
of course. So
It's it's hard. It's hard. It's a lot of juggling. I think that I would say to people that I was very fortunate at a younger age to find my sense of vocation. I think that's an old-fashioned word. We don't use the word vocation anymore. People talk about jobs or whatever, but because I come from a religious background, this idea of vocation, which is the idea that you were uniquely created to do something in this world and find that. And when you find it, it will not be work, it will be joy. And so I have spent my entire career in higher education and love it and love the classroom, and haven't been there recently because of being a dean. But I found a place to operate in my vocational call, which is training the next generation of scholars and teachers and ministers and what have you. So I think for me, my advice would be to people to find a calling, right? Find that sense of vocation, find that place where the work that you are doing, there's such a sense of joy and urgency and need there, because it's going to be hard no matter what, right? So I'm constantly juggling the demands of, administrative work at a school, and then continuing my own scholarship and writing, and then all of the rest, right, in the middle of a global pandemic. But there's a joy in the work because it is life or death for me. I sense on the other side of it that someone needs what I have and I need what someone else has. So yeah, it's an old fashioned, but I would say the sense of vocation is really, really important.
yes, they talk about, the purpose-driven life, which is said. My father always said to me, find your hobby, find your passion,
Yes,
and that's going to keep you going.
absolutely.
One of the last quote you end with is, our ancestors never die until there is no one to call their name. I love that quote because, the importance of saying their name, African proverb. So just from your perspective, who are the names who you are calling? Why is it important that we build on the legacy? And then connected to that, as we come to a close, is that we host the National Black Writers Conference every other year. There are some who will say, why are you having a conference just focused on Black writers? What are your thoughts on doing that in this time, as opposed to just having a conference on writers?
I think it's so critically important to have a space where Black writers can come, can focus, can celebrate, lament, and all of those things. It is for me connected to this question of the ancestral, right? One of the things that I talk about is that we have to be very clear. Most of us don't know who many of our ancestors were. Right? That unfortunately, if you are of African of American descent, you are likely to be the product of chattel slavery. You might only be able to trace your family history to a certain point and not even very far, to be perfectly honest with you. So what I want us to think about, instead of just ancestors in terms of genealogy, is what the biblical scripture talks about, which is the great cloud of witnesses, which is all of the people who have come before before you who have poured into who you are. And so I call Harriet Tubman an ancestor. Am I related by blood to Harriet Tubman? I doubt it. I don't really know. But
you never know.
Right, but I never know, right? But what it is that I can celebrate her courage, right? Frederick Douglass, so there's a Nat Turner. So I think about a Nat Turner as someone who is a minister and as someone who made a very controversial but courageous decision. Like, so this great cloud of witnesses belongs to us, and it is not narrowly defined by the genealogy. And so places of Black writers conferences, or here I'm at Howard University, a historically Black college and university, we need places to celebrate. We need places to talk about our lives and our culture and the ways we navigate this world. We need places of catharsis and also places of hope. That's what these spaces often provide for us, right? That they're not segregated spaces where what we're talking about is white people. We're actually, no, this is Zora Neale Hurston again. We're just celebrating ourselves, right? We do that without the white gaze. And so just absolutely affirming the need sometimes for people just to be together, and the sense of home is with one another.
So thank you very much. That is a wonderful way to conclude. And I've been talking with the Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce, the author of In My Grandmother's House, Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit. I thank you so much for visiting with us. And I encourage our writers to write me at writers@mec.cuny.edu. Visit our website, where you can also get see a video of this program. And this radio broadcast is paid for by Medgar Evers College. Thank you so much. Remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. Thank you.
Thank you.